February 8, 1944. Imperial Japanese Navy Headquarters, Tokyo. Commander Yoshio Nakamura's pen hovered over the intelligence report, his expression shifting from curiosity to disbelief to something approaching amusement. The photographs spread across his desk showed vessels so ungainly, so fundamentally wrong in their design, that he initially assumed they were decoys meant to confuse reconnaissance aircraft. Flat-bottomed steel boxes with hinged bow doors. No apparent armament worth noting. Maximum speed estimated at 11 knots, slower than most cargo freighters, barely faster than a brisk sailing yacht. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. He called over his subordinate, Lieutenant Kenji Matsuda, pointing at the images with the end of his pen. The lieutenant leaned in, studying the peculiar craft documented by aerial reconnaissance near the Solomon Islands. These vessels violated every principle of naval architecture the Imperial Navy held sacred. They possessed no elegant lines, no knife-edge bows to cut through waves, no graceful curves that spoke of speed and power. They were, in the most literal sense, floating boxes with engines attached. Commander Nakamura wrote in his assessment that day, preserved now in the National Institute for Defense Studies in Tokyo, American landing vessels represent desperate measure by enemy lacking proper amphibious craft. Flat hull design renders vessels unsuitable for open ocean transit. Slow speed makes them vulnerable targets. Hinged bow mechanism appears fragile, likely to fail under combat conditions. Assessment: minimal threat to coastal defenses. These craft will founder in moderate seas or be destroyed easily by coastal artillery. His assessment was filed, circulated among naval staff, and generally agreed upon. Senior officers nodded approvingly at Nakamura's analysis. The Americans, it seemed, were so desperate for landing craft they had resorted to building what amounted to cargo barges with doors on the front. The vessels were designated in reports as steel barges or box boats, terms that carried inherent mockery. No proper navy would build such things. The very existence of these craft confirmed what many in the Imperial Navy wanted to believe, that American shipbuilding, for all its vaunted production capacity, sacrificed quality for quantity, elegance for expediency. What Commander Nakamura and his colleagues could not have known, what their entire framework of naval warfare could not accommodate, was that they were looking at the vehicle that would deliver defeat to every beach they tried to defend. The LST, landing ship tank, was not a compromise or a desperate measure. It was a revolution in logistics disguised as an ugly boat. The mockery began in earnest after the Tarawa landings in November 1943. Japanese defenders there had been overwhelmed, but survivors brought back accounts of American landing operations that seemed to confirm every prejudice about these strange vessels. Private First Class Tadashi Yamamoto, one of only 17 Japanese soldiers to survive the battle out of nearly 5,000 defenders, provided detailed testimony during his interrogation at a POW facility in Hawaii. Yamamoto described watching the American assault unfold from his position in a reinforced bunker on the lagoon side of BDO Island. He had expected the Americans to use proper landing craft, the kind that made sense to a military mind trained in conventional naval operations. Instead, he watched these massive steel boxes grinding toward shore, their flat bottoms scraping across the coral reef that had torn apart so many smaller craft. The boxes kept coming, undeterred by the reef that should have stopped them, unstoppable despite their awkward appearance. What struck Yamamoto most was not their resilience but what happened after they beached. The front of each vessel opened like a massive mouth, and from within poured an unending stream of vehicles, artillery pieces, supply crates, and men. He watched one vessel discharge 6 Sherman tanks, followed by trucks, followed by pallets of ammunition, followed by more trucks. The process took perhaps 15 minutes, and then the vessel backed off the beach, turned around with painful slowness, and headed back to sea. His interrogators noted his confusion when he tried to explain what he had witnessed. Yamamoto kept returning to the same point: the vessels were not beautiful, not fast, not elegant. They were ugly and slow and ungainly. But they worked with an efficiency that bordered on the mechanical, the inevitable. They delivered war to the beach with the same impersonal reliability as a factory assembly line. Japanese naval intelligence compiled these reports with growing unease that they could not quite articulate. The vessels were clearly effective, the evidence was undeniable, yet they remained fundamentally wrong according to every principle of naval design. Captain Tamichi Hara, one of Japan's most experienced destroyer commanders, reviewed the intelligence summaries in early 1944 and wrote in his personal journal, later published as Japanese Destroyer Captain, his observations about these American craft. Hara noted that the vessels seemed purpose-built for a kind of warfare the Imperial Navy had never seriously contemplated. Japanese amphibious doctrine relied on speed, surprise, and the use of purpose-built landing craft that were essentially expendable. The Americans had instead created reusable, ocean-going vessels that could make multiple trips, that could cross oceans under their own power, that could beach themselves deliberately and then retreat. It was wasteful, Hara thought. Why build such large vessels for landing operations when smaller, faster craft would suffice? What Hara and other Japanese commanders failed to grasp was scale. They were thinking in terms of individual vessels and individual landings. The Americans were thinking in terms of systems and sustained operations. An LST was not designed to make one trip. It was designed to make dozens of trips, hundreds even, delivering thousands of tons of supplies over weeks and months of continuous operations. The true nature of the LST began to reveal itself during the Marshall Islands campaign in early 1944. Japanese garrisons on Kwajalein and Eniwetok atolls found themselves facing not an assault but an avalanche. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Americans did not simply land and establish a beachhead. They constructed entire bases, seemingly overnight, with a speed that defied rational explanation. Lieutenant Commander Masao Yoshida, the senior surviving officer from Kwajalein's garrison, provided testimony that would circulate through Japanese military channels with increasing alarm. Yoshida had commanded the coastal defense batteries on the lagoon side of Kwajalein Island. His position gave him an unobstructed view of American landing operations, and he observed them with the trained eye of a professional officer. On the first day of the invasion, January 31, 1944, Yoshida counted 43 of the flat-bottomed vessels approaching the beaches. They came in waves, not randomly but in organized sequences. The first wave delivered tanks and artillery. The second wave brought trucks and ammunition. The third wave carried construction equipment, bulldozers and graders and cranes. The fourth wave delivered fuel trucks and supply dumps. By the end of the first day, Yoshida estimated the Americans had landed more vehicles and equipment than the entire Japanese garrison had possessed when fully supplied. But it was the second day that shattered his understanding. The same vessels returned. And the third day. And the fourth. Each vessel, Yoshida calculated, made at least 2 trips per day, sometimes 3. Each trip delivered between 1,500 and 3,000 tons of cargo directly onto the beach. By the 5th day, when Japanese resistance collapsed, the Americans had constructed what amounted to a fully functional port facility on beaches that 5 days earlier had been defended by concrete bunkers and barbed wire. Yoshida's report, filed after his capture and interrogation, included detailed sketches of the landing operations. He had watched through field glasses as these ungainly vessels approached the beach, dropped their bow ramps, and simply drove vehicles off directly onto sand. No cranes needed. No lighters or barges to transfer cargo from ship to shore. No complex unloading procedures. Just drive the cargo off the ship and onto the beach. His interrogators, American officers familiar with LST operations, found Yoshida's fascination almost touching. To them, this was simply how things were done. To Yoshida, trained in a navy where every operation required careful planning and complex procedures, this brutal simplicity was revolutionary. He kept asking his interrogators the same question in different forms: how could this be efficient? How could this crude method possibly work better than proper naval logistics? The Americans tried to explain. An LST could carry 20 Sherman tanks or 60 vehicles or 1,500 tons of general cargo. It could cross oceans under its own power, required no special port facilities, could beach itself on any reasonably flat shore, and could unload its entire cargo in less than 2 hours. Then it could back off the beach, return to the supply ships waiting offshore or at rear bases, reload, and make another trip. In the time it took to use traditional methods to unload one cargo ship at a port, a fleet of LSTs could deliver 10 times as much material directly to combat zones. Yoshida understood the mathematics. He simply could not accept that warfare had become this crude, this industrial, this divorced from the martial traditions he had been trained to uphold. War was supposed to be about courage, skill, tactical brilliance. These vessels reduced war to accounting, to tonnage delivered per day, to logistics spreadsheets. Back in Tokyo, naval staff officers reviewed Yoshida's report with mounting concern that they still could not fully articulate. The vessels were effective, clearly. But they remained aesthetically wrong, philosophically wrong. They represented a kind of warfare that reduced naval operations to cargo delivery, that treated the ocean as merely an obstacle to be overcome rather than a domain to be mastered. Commander Nakamura, who had written the original dismissive assessment, was asked to update his evaluation. He studied the new intelligence, the reports from Tarawa, the detailed observations from Kwajalein, the growing body of evidence that these steel boxes were more than curiosities. His revised assessment, submitted in March 1944, acknowledged their effectiveness but maintained his fundamental critique. The vessels worked, he conceded, but only because the Americans possessed overwhelming material superiority. Against a properly equipped and supplied defensive force, these slow, vulnerable craft would be decimated. He was half right. The LSTs were vulnerable. They were slow. They were ungainly. But what he failed to account for was that the Americans did not need individual vessels to survive. They needed the system to function. If one LST was sunk, 3 more would take its place. If a beach became too dangerous, LSTs would simply land somewhere else. The vessels were not precious assets to be conserved. They were tools to be used, and if necessary, used up. The true revelation came not from battle reports but from captured documents. In April 1944, a Japanese submarine managed to sink an American destroyer escort near the Philippines. Among the wreckage and debris recovered were several water-damaged but partially legible operations manuals and logistics schedules. These documents, painstakingly dried and translated by intelligence officers, revealed something that transformed Japanese understanding of what they faced. The Americans were not building dozens of these vessels. They were building hundreds. The production schedules indicated that American shipyards were completing LSTs at a rate of 3 per week, every week, from multiple shipyards simultaneously. The logistics plans called for sustained operations where 50, 60, 70 LSTs would support a single invasion, making multiple trips daily, delivering aggregate tonnages that exceeded the total supply capacity of entire Japanese fleets. One document, a planning memo for future operations, casually referenced the delivery of 50,000 tons of supplies daily to invasion beaches, sustained over weeks of operations. Lieutenant Matsuda, assisting in the translation, checked his mathematics 3 times before presenting the figures to his superiors. 50,000 tons daily was more than the Japanese Navy could transport to all its forward bases in a month. The Americans were planning to deliver that much to a single beach, every single day. The psychological impact of this discovery rippled through naval headquarters. It suggested a level of industrial capacity that bordered on the fantastical. Captain Hara, reviewing the translated documents, wrote in his journal that night, "We are not fighting a navy. We are fighting an industrial system that happens to float. These ugly steel barges are not ships in any sense we understand. They are factory output, mass-produced tools designed to overwhelm through quantity and efficiency rather than quality and skill." Senior officers demanded verification. Surely the documents were propaganda, exaggeration, American psychological warfare. But aerial reconnaissance confirmed the basics. Photographs from long-range scout planes showed dozens of these vessels at advanced bases, at staging areas, clustered around islands like steel rum or a fish around a whale. The Americans were not hiding their logistics. They did not need to. The scale itself was a kind of weapon, a demonstration of capacity that could not be countered. What the Japanese High Command still did not fully grasp, what they would not truly understand until much later, was that the LST was not simply a vessel. It was a component in a system that had redesigned the fundamental nature of amphibious warfare. For centuries, landing an army on a hostile shore had been one of the most complex and risky military operations possible. It required careful planning, perfect timing, favorable conditions, and more than a little luck. The LST and its supporting systems had turned invasion into a routine, repeatable process. Not easy, not without risk, but routine. Achievable. Inevitable. Commander Nakamura, increasingly isolated in his original assessment but unable to fully abandon it, wrote a final memo in May 1944. He acknowledged that the Americans had achieved something remarkable with these vessels. But he insisted that their success was a temporary phenomenon, dependent on facing weakened defenders with limited supplies and no air support. Against properly prepared positions, with adequate supplies and determined resistance, these slow, vulnerable craft would prove inadequate. He was writing this memo at the same time that American planners were finalizing details for the invasion of Saipan, where LSTs would deliver 50,000 tons daily to beaches, sustained over 3 weeks of intense combat. He was clinging to his assessment while American shipyards prepared to increase LST production even further, targeting a fleet of over 1,000 such vessels. He was defending his original conclusion while the evidence mounted that he had fundamentally misunderstood not just a vessel type but an entirely new approach to warfare. The steel barges that Japanese commanders had mocked were about to demonstrate exactly what industrial warfare looked like when applied without restraint to the problem of logistics. And the commanders who had laughed would soon find themselves defending beaches against an enemy that could replace every loss, reinforce every success, and simply outlast any resistance through the sheer weight of delivered tonnage. The true nature of what Japan faced became undeniable during the Saipan operation in June 1944. Vice Admiral Chichi Nagumo, who had commanded the carrier strike force at Pearl Harbor and now found himself in charge of defending this critical island, stood on the heights above Charan-Kanoa Beach and watched the American armada assemble offshore. Through his field glasses, he counted the vessels arrayed against his garrison. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, all the expected elements of an invasion fleet. And behind them, stretching to the horizon, an endless procession of those flat-bottomed steel boxes. Nagumo had read the intelligence reports. He understood intellectually what these vessels represented. But seeing them in reality, seeing the sheer number of them, transformed abstract knowledge into visceral dread. They came not in dozens but in scores, forming orderly lines that extended beyond his ability to count accurately. His chief of staff, Captain Takahashi, attempted a tally using binoculars and notepaper. He gave up after counting past 80 vessels, and more continued to arrive throughout the day. The landing began at dawn on June 15, 1944. Nagumo's coastal defense guns opened fire immediately, and several of the steel boxes took direct hits. He watched through field glasses as shells struck home, saw the explosions, felt a moment of grim satisfaction. The vessels were as vulnerable as intelligence had suggested. But then he noticed something that chilled him more than the bombardment from American battleships. The damaged vessels simply withdrew. Others immediately took their place. The rhythm of the landing never faltered. Wave after wave of these craft beached themselves below his observation post. The bow ramps dropped with mechanical precision, and outpoured an invasion in industrial form. Tanks rolled onto the sand in neat columns. Trucks followed, then artillery pieces, then more tanks, then supply pallets, then ambulances, then command vehicles. Each vessel took approximately 20 minutes to unload completely, then reversed off the beach and headed back to sea. Within 3 hours of the initial landing, Nagumo estimated the Americans had put more vehicles ashore than his entire garrison possessed. But the numbers that truly devastated his defensive strategy came later. By nightfall of the first day, American forces had established a beachhead nearly 2 miles deep. More critically, they had established supply dumps that Nagumo could see clearly from his position. Stacks of crates, rows of fuel drums, ammunition dumps protected by hasty earthworks, all growing larger by the hour. His own garrison's supply situation was precarious. He had stockpiled enough food and ammunition for perhaps 3 months of sustained combat, assuming careful rationing and no resupply. The Americans had landed what appeared to be equivalent supplies in a single day. Captain Takahashi compiled reports throughout the battle, documenting the landing operations with meticulous attention. His notes, recovered after the battle by American forces and now preserved in the National Archives, revealed a growing horror of understanding. On June 16, the second day of battle, Takahashi counted 62 separate LST landings on the beaches his units could observe. Assuming similar activity on other beaches, he estimated the Americans were conducting over 100 landings daily. Each landing delivered an average of 2,000 tons of cargo. Takahashi's mathematics was conservative. The actual tonnage delivered to Saipan beaches during the first week of operations exceeded 55,000 tons daily. The Americans were landing more supplies every 2 days than Japan could transport to Saipan in 6 months. More devastating still, this rate did not decrease. The vessels simply kept coming, making multiple trips, maintaining a rhythm that seemed mechanically inevitable. By June 20, 5 days into the battle, Nagumo's ammunition reserves had dwindled to critical levels. His artillery fired sporadically, conserving shells for defensive fires against direct assaults. American artillery fired continuously, supported by ammunition dumps that grew rather than shrank despite massive expenditure. Nagumo watched American supply vessels beach themselves in what had been a combat zone just hours earlier, as if the battle itself was merely a temporary inconvenience to their logistics schedule. On June 25, Nagumo received his final orders from Tokyo. The garrison was to fight to the last man, inflicting maximum casualties on the enemy. No surrender, no retreat. He acknowledged the orders and prepared for the final defense. But that evening, he confided to Captain Takahashi his true thoughts about the battle. His words were recorded in Takahashi's diary, found on his body after the final banzai charge. Nagumo said he had not been defeated by American courage or tactical superiority. He had been buried under American logistics. The admiral pointed out to sea, where even in the darkness the silhouettes of those flat-bottomed vessels could be seen moving between the transport anchorage and the beaches. They never stopped, Nagumo observed. Day or night, rain or clear weather, under artillery fire or air attack, they simply continued their mechanical process of delivery. This was not warfare as he understood it. This was industrial production applied to combat, a factory whose output was sustained military capability measured in tons per hour. Nagumo died on July 6, 1944, during the final collapse of Japanese resistance. He did not live to see the full scale of what those steel barges could accomplish, but his final observations proved prophetic. The Americans were not fighting a traditional military campaign. They were executing an industrial process, and the LST was the primary tool of that execution. Similar realizations swept through other Japanese garrisons as American forces advanced across the Pacific. On Guam, Major General Takeshi Takashina watched the same pattern unfold. His carefully prepared defensive positions, his stockpiled ammunition, his veteran troops, all proved irrelevant against an enemy that could simply deliver more material than he could expend. On Tinian, Colonel Kiyoshi Ogata calculated that American forces were landing supplies faster than his entire garrison could possibly consume them, even if every Japanese soldier spent all day shooting. The psychological impact proved as devastating as the material superiority. Japanese soldiers defending these islands had been told they were facing a wealthy but soft enemy, an industrial society that would crumble when faced with true martial spirit. Instead, they found themselves fighting an enemy that treated warfare like a manufacturing problem to be solved through efficiency and volume. The steel barges became symbols of this inverted reality, ugly vessels that nonetheless worked with remorseless effectiveness. Intercepted Japanese communications from this period reveal the spreading demoralization. Radio operators on bypassed islands reported watching these vessels supply American garrisons that had isolated Japanese defenders. The Americans did not simply capture an island and move on. They built it into a base, supplied it continuously, turned it into another node in their expanding logistics network. Islands that Japan had spent years fortifying became American bases in weeks, supplied by those same ungainly craft that naval officers had initially mocked. Lieutenant General Tadamaki Kurabayashi, assigned to defend Iwo Jima in mid-1944, studied all available intelligence on American landing operations before beginning his defensive preparations. Kurabayashi was widely regarded as one of Japan's most capable commanders, a realist who understood material factors and did not indulge in wishful thinking about spiritual superiority overcoming industrial might. His analysis of the LST operations informed his entire defensive strategy. Kurabayashi concluded that he could not prevent American forces from landing. The LSTs made any beach defensible into a viable landing site. He could not prevent American forces from establishing supply superiority. The sustained delivery capacity of these vessels meant the Americans would always have more ammunition, more fuel, more everything than his garrison. His only option was to make American victory as costly as possible by forcing them to fight for every yard of ground, bleeding them through attrition rather than attempting to defeat them through conventional defensive tactics. His assessment, sent to Imperial General Headquarters in September 1944, included detailed observations about American logistics capabilities. Kurabayashi wrote that defending beaches against LST-based invasions was futile. The vessels were too numerous, too persistent, and too capable. Even if defenders sank 10% of the landing force, the remaining 90% would deliver sufficient material to overwhelm any defense. Even if defenders destroyed half the landing vessels, the Americans would simply send more. Kurabayashi's report concluded with a stark warning. Japan was not fighting battles in the traditional sense. Japan was being subjected to an industrial process of defeat, where American material superiority, delivered through vessels like the LST, made the outcome of any individual engagement predetermined. The only variable was how long Japanese forces could delay the inevitable and at what cost to American forces. Imperial General Headquarters filed Kurabayashi's report and ordered him to defend Iwo Jima to the last man. His analysis was accurate, but accuracy did not change strategic reality. Japan had no counter to American logistics. The empire could not produce equivalent vessels, could not sustain similar delivery rates, could not match the industrial output that made such operations possible. Japanese forces would defend, would fight with extraordinary courage, and would ultimately be overwhelmed by tonnage. The Battle of Iwo Jima, beginning February 19, 1945, proved Kurabayashi's assessment entirely correct. American forces landed against the most sophisticated defensive positions Japan had ever constructed. Kurabayashi had turned the entire island into a fortress, with interconnected tunnels, mutually supporting positions, and carefully registered artillery that made every beach a killing ground. For a few hours on that first day, his defenders inflicted terrible casualties on the landing forces. Then the LSTs arrived. Kurabayashi watched from his command post deep in Mount Suribachi's tunnel complex as the steel barges began their work. Despite heavy fire, despite casualties, despite everything his garrison could throw at them, the vessels maintained their schedule. They beached, unloaded, withdrew, returned. By the end of the first day, American forces had landed more supplies than Kurabayashi's garrison had consumed in 6 months of preparation. By the end of the first week, American supply dumps on the beaches exceeded the total stockpile Kurabayashi had accumulated through years of effort. His defensive strategy of attrition required American forces to advance slowly, expending enormous amounts of ammunition to root out defenders from their prepared positions. This strategy worked tactically. American forces advanced mere yards per day, suffering casualties for every foot of ground gained. But strategically, the strategy failed because it required Americans to run out of ammunition, and they never did. The LSTs simply delivered more shells, more bullets, more explosives. When American artillery exhausted its ammunition in a day of bombardment, more ammunition arrived that night. When American tanks ran low on fuel, fuel trucks delivered by LST resupplied them within hours. Major Yoshitaka Hori, serving as supply officer for the Iwo Jima garrison, kept detailed records of American logistics that he later published in his memoir. Hori calculated that during the 36 days of battle, American forces expended more ammunition than the Japanese military had manufactured in the entire year of 1944. This expenditure was sustained not through careful conservation but through continuous resupply. The LSTs made it possible to wage warfare without logistical constraints, to expend material freely because more material would arrive within hours. Hori noted that Japanese supply doctrine emphasized conservation, careful rationing, making each shell count. American supply doctrine, as revealed through their operations, emphasized availability. Do not ration, do not conserve, use whatever is needed to accomplish the mission because supply is not a constraint. This philosophical difference, enabled by vessels like the LST, meant American forces fought without the hesitation that shortage imposed. They could call in artillery strikes freely, could expend thousands of rounds to suppress a single position, could replace damaged equipment immediately rather than repairing it under fire. The battle for Iwo Jima ended on March 26, 1945. Kurabayashi and most of his garrison died in the fighting. American forces suffered over 26,000 casualties, including nearly 7,000 killed. It was the costliest battle in Marine Corps history. And yet, from a logistics perspective, it was simply another demonstration of LST capabilities. The vessels had delivered everything needed to sustain operations, had maintained supply flow regardless of combat intensity, had turned a tiny volcanic island into a fully stocked base despite desperate enemy resistance. Similar patterns repeated at Okinawa starting April 1, 1945. Japanese commanders on Okinawa had studied Iwo Jima carefully. They understood that defending beaches was futile. They understood that fighting American material superiority directly was hopeless. They adopted tactics focused on prolonging the battle, inflicting maximum casualties, forcing Americans to expend maximum resources. And still, the LSTs arrived. Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, senior staff officer for the Japanese 32nd Army defending Okinawa, calculated that American forces were landing over 70,000 tons of supplies daily on Okinawa beaches. His own army, with over 100,000 men, had accumulated perhaps 50,000 tons of supplies total before the invasion. The Americans were landing more every single day than his entire army possessed. This disparity made traditional defensive calculations meaningless. There was no way to outlast an enemy with effectively infinite supplies. Yahara survived the battle, one of the few senior Japanese officers to do so, and his post-war writings provide crucial insight into Japanese understanding of what they faced. He wrote that the LST and similar vessels had fundamentally altered the nature of warfare. In previous conflicts, armies fought with what they could carry or what could be supplied through vulnerable logistics chains. Cut the supply line and you crippled the army. But these American vessels created supply capacity that could not be cut. They brought the supply line with them, reusable and persistent. The kamikaze special attack units targeting shipping off Okinawa prioritized these ugly cargo vessels, recognizing finally their critical importance. Between April and June 1945, kamikaze aircraft sank or damaged dozens of LSTs and similar craft. American losses were real and painful. But the losses did not matter to the outcome because replacement vessels arrived faster than they could be sunk. For every LST sent to the bottom, 2 more arrived from American shipyards. The math was brutal and simple. Japan could not sink them faster than America could build them. By the time Okinawa fell in June 1945, Japanese military leadership fully understood what they faced. The steel barges they had mocked in 1944 represented something far more threatening than any battleship or carrier. Those prestigious vessels could be sunk, could be destroyed, could be defeated in battle. The LST could not be defeated because it was not a weapon but a system. Sinking individual vessels accomplished nothing when the system continued functioning. Admiral Mato Magaki, commander of the 5th Air Fleet and a key figure in kamikaze operations, wrote in his diary in July 1945 about the futility of attacking American logistics. He described watching reconnaissance footage of American bases, seeing rows and rows of those flat-bottomed vessels, realizing that Japan had already lost the war before the first major battle. Not lost because Japanese spirit was weak or tactics were flawed, but because the other side had built a logistics system that made material shortage impossible. They had created sustained abundance through industrial production applied to military supply. The final irony came after Japan's surrender. American occupation forces used LSTs to deliver food and supplies to a starving Japanese civilian population. The same vessels that had delivered military defeat now delivered humanitarian assistance. Japanese officials working with American occupation authorities encountered these craft again, now filled with rice and medical supplies instead of tanks and ammunition. The vessels had not changed. They remained ugly, ungainly, slow. But they worked, and in late 1945, when millions faced starvation, working mattered more than elegance. Former Commander Nakamura, surviving the war to work as a maritime consultant during occupation, was assigned to help organize supply distribution using American vessels. He found himself boarding an LST for the first time, walking through its cavernous cargo hold, observing its simple but functional design. He wrote in a private letter discovered years later that he finally understood what he had been looking at in those reconnaissance photos back in 1944. This was not a warship designed to impress or intimidate. It was a tool designed to work, built with the assumption that working well mattered more than looking impressive. The steel barges had won the war not through firepower but through capacity, not through speed but through persistence, not through elegance but through function. They had transformed every defended beach into an undefendable position, had made every island fortress into a temporary obstacle, had rendered traditional defensive calculations obsolete. They were, in the most fundamental sense, the embodiment of industrial warfare, where victory came not from superior tactics or greater courage but from the ability to deliver more material to the point of decision than the enemy could possibly counter. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.